And a little more than a week before Trump's inauguration, Special Counsel Jack Smith has officially resigned from the Justice Department. This comes after Smith wrapped up 2 criminal investigations into the president-elect. Smith had already signaled after Trump won the 2024 election that he planned on stepping down. Smith had been investigating Trump's classified documents case and allegations. Trump tried to overturn the 2020 election. The Attorney General is expected to release at least part of the special counsel's report this week.
Hey everybody, Adam is here. So this is happening. We have reached a moment in American legal history that has no precedent. For years, the conversation around Donald Trump's criminal exposure has been dominated by political spin, by procedural maneuvering, and by a fog of conflicting narratives about what the evidence actually shows. That fog just burned away.
Willie, good morning. There is new legal action in that effort you just mentioned this morning. Attorney General Merrick Garland told Congress on Wednesday that he does plan to release the election interference part of Jack Smith's report if a federal judge's order blocking the release was overruled. An appeals court did that on Thursday, but they kept in force the order for a 3-day delay before the report's release. Today is day 3. And last night, though, the district judge in Florida gave the government until 10 o'clock this morning to assure her that this report does not reference the remaining co-defendants in Smith's other investigation into those classified documents at Trump's Florida estate.
What we have in front of us now is not speculation. It is not anonymous sourcing. It is not partisan characterization. It is the official, sworn, documented assessment of the special counsel who spent years building the cases, reviewing every piece of evidence, interviewing every witness, and evaluating every legal argument. And that assessment, delivered in a 137-page final report and repeated under oath to Congress, is devastating.
This morning, Special Counsel Jack Smith saying the government had enough evidence to convict Donald Trump had he not been reelected. An extraordinary capstone to an investigation into the president-elect's efforts to maintain power after he lost the 2020 election. A report spanning more than 100 pages, now the final word on Smith's findings in the historic case that was set to go to a jury in Washington, if not for the department's long-standing policy against prosecuting a sitting president. The special counsel writing, but for Mr. Trump's election and imminent return to the presidency, the office assessed that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial. Smith laying out what he called Trump's unprecedented criminal effort to hold on to power, including pressure on state officials and on his vice president to overturn the 2020 results. Smith also focusing on Trump's encouragement of the January 6 rioters.
We fight like hell.
The president-elect pled not guilty to all charges.
Special Counsel Jack Smith concluded in writing that the admissible evidence in both the election interference case and the classified documents case was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction, not sufficient to bring charges, not sufficient to survive a motion to dismiss, sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the highest evidentiary standard in the American legal system. And Smith said it plainly. The only reason those cases never went to trial is because Donald Trump won the election before they could, not because the evidence was weak, not because the legal theories were flawed, not because witnesses were unreliable, because a sitting president cannot be prosecuted by the federal government he controls. That is the specific escape hatch that ended the federal prosecutions, a constitutional rule, not a factual defense. And then Judge Tanya Chutkan unsealed a 165-page brief from Smith's team that prosecutors called their most detailed account yet of how Trump, acting in a personal capacity, used private co-conspirators and false fraud claims to try to overturn the election. Nearly 1,100 pages of heavily redacted evidence followed, unsealed over the objections of Trump's own lawyers. The judge's reasoning was stark. Keeping the evidence secret could itself look like election interference. The public had a right to see the record. That is, a federal judge, appointed by a Republican president, saying that the evidence is so significant that hiding it would undermine faith in the electoral process. Legal analysts covering the case have noted that Trump's legal team has largely stopped disputing the factual record. Instead, they are asking for years of delay, trial dates as far out as April 2026, because the documents, recordings, and insider testimony line up too neatly for a clean factual defense. The scramble is real. The evidence is irrefutable. And we are going to walk through every piece of it right now. Let's start with the source that matters most: Jack Smith's own conclusions. When the special counsel says the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction, he is not making a political argument. He is not writing an op-ed. He is delivering a professional evidentiary assessment based on the specific legal standard that governs criminal trials. Beyond a reasonable doubt is the highest bar in our legal system. It requires a unanimous jury to conclude that guilt has been proven to a moral certainty. Smith reviewed the entire evidentiary record, every document, every recording, every witness interview, and concluded that the government could meet that standard in both cases: the election interference case and the classified documents case. Not one case, both. The "but for his election and imminent return to the presidency" qualification in Smith's report is the most important phrase you will read in any legal document this year. It establishes what the case was about and what it was not about. It was not about insufficient evidence. It was not about flawed legal theories. It was not about unreliable witnesses. It was about a constitutional rule. Sitting presidents cannot be prosecuted by the federal government they control. That is the specific technicality of power that ended the federal prosecutions. And Smith's report is explicit that the evidence would have met the conviction standard if that constitutional barrier had not applied. Now let's get into what that evidence actually contains, because the unsealed documents give us the clearest picture yet of the case that would have gone to trial. We are going to walk through three dimensions: the election interference evidence, the classified documents evidence, and the delay strategy that reveals more about the strength of the case than any legal argument could. First, the election interference evidence. The 165-page Chutkan brief is the most comprehensive public account of what the election interference case actually rests on, and its central legal argument is a masterclass in threading the immunity needle. The brief argues that Trump was acting in his personal capacity as a candidate, not in his official capacity as president. This distinction matters because the Supreme Court's own immunity framework gives zero protection to private conduct. The fake elector coordination, the pressure campaigns on state officials, the schemes run by campaign lawyers, all of these fall squarely in the private conduct category. The brief builds the evidentiary case specifically around these categories, documenting Trump's actions through private co-conspirators, campaign operatives, outside lawyers, and state-level pressure campaigns, rather than through official governmental channels that might attract immunity. The advisor testimony dimension is equally devastating. The brief documents multiple occasions where Mike Pence, campaign lawyers, and senior advisors told Trump there was no evidence of widespread fraud, that recounts had confirmed the results, and that courts had rejected his claims. Yet he continued to push the fake elector scheme and pressure state officials. That is not a case where a president was acting on genuinely held beliefs about fraud. It is a case where the documented record shows he was told repeatedly by his own most trusted advisors that the fraud claims were false, and he kept pushing them anyway. That pattern, being told the claims are false and continuing to make them, is the specific evidentiary foundation for the knowing and willful element of the obstruction charges. The Pence notes deserve special attention. They are not the recollections of a witness describing conversations months or years later. They are contemporaneous written records made during or immediately after the relevant conversations by someone whose constitutional role in the certification process gave him the most direct available access to the exchanges most central to the obstruction theory. Pence was simultaneously managing his own constitutional obligation and documenting what he was being asked to do in ways that conflicted with those obligations. That contemporaneous character, combined with Pence's specific constitutional role, makes the notes one of the most credible pieces of the entire evidentiary record. Second, the classified documents evidence. The discovery disclosure ran to 833,000 pages, with 4,500 key documents identified as central to the case. The surveillance footage showing boxes being moved after the subpoena is objective visual documentation of physical obstruction conduct. You cannot argue with a video of boxes being relocated after a legal demand for their return. The witness testimony describing Trump telling others that he wanted to keep my documents is the specific inside account of possessory intent that the unauthorized retention charges require. A defendant who refers to classified documents as my documents is a defendant who has formed the specific intent to retain rather than return them. And the Corcoran notes, compelled through the crime-fraud exception, record Trump's specific statements about hiding boxes and the false certification discussion. Those notes are contemporaneous professional documentation of conversations that go to the heart of the obstruction theory. Smith's assessment that this evidence would have supported a strong obstruction case is not a casual observation. It is a professional prosecutorial validation that the individual pieces, taken together, establish the beyond a reasonable doubt threshold that the sufficient to sustain a conviction language requires. He is not saying the case was strong enough to survive a motion to dismiss. He is saying the evidence met the standard for a unanimous jury to convict. Third, the delay strategy. This is where the legal team's behavior tells you more about the strength of the evidence than any legal brief could. In normal criminal defense, when a defendant believes the evidence against them is weak or fabricated, the strategic calculus favors speed. You move toward trial quickly before the prosecution can build additional evidence. You seek dismissal of charges that cannot withstand factual scrutiny. You demonstrate to the public and the courts that the charges are without merit through the transparent adversarial process of a trial. That is what a defense looks like when the facts are on your side. Trump's legal team is doing the opposite. They are asking for years of delay, trial dates as far out as April 2026. They are filing procedural motions seeking delay, immunity determinations, jurisdictional challenges, everything except a direct engagement with the documentary record that Smith assembled. Legal analysts have specifically noted that the delay requests are paired with an absence of direct factual disputation of most of the evidentiary record. The legal team is not filing detailed responses contesting the specific factual claims in Smith's brief. They are not pointing to exculpatory evidence that the prosecution ignored. They are not identifying witnesses who would contradict the government's account. They are asking for time, more time, years of time. That pattern, procedural delay rather than factual rebuttal, is the strategic signature of a defense that cannot rebut the facts and is therefore seeking to avoid the factual confrontation for as long as possible. When you have no answer to the evidence, you try to run out the clock, and the clock in this case is running on a very specific timetable. The only reason the cases never went to trial was because Trump won the election before they could. The legal team is now trying to ensure that any future trial is delayed until after the next election cycle, gambling that a political outcome might once again provide the escape hatch that a factual defense cannot. Let's bring this together with 4 clear points that define exactly where the legal landscape stands. The authority of the source matters. Jack Smith is not a Democratic operative. He is not a cable news commentator. He is the specific prosecutor who built both cases, reviewed every piece of evidence, examined every witness, and evaluated every legal argument. His conclusion that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction is the most authoritative available assessment of what the evidence actually shows, and he delivered that conclusion in an official report and under oath to Congress. That is not spin. That is the professional judgment of the person with the most complete access to the full evidentiary record. The but for his election qualification establishes what the case was and was not about. It was not about insufficient evidence. It was not about flawed legal theories. It was not about unreliable witnesses. It was about a constitutional rule that made trial impossible once Trump regained the presidency. The escape hatch was political, not legal. The cases did not collapse because the government could not prove its case. They collapsed because the defendant regained the power to prevent his own prosecution. The unsealed evidence is devastating. The Pence notes are contemporaneous written records from the vice president documenting conversations at the heart of the obstruction theory. The surveillance footage shows boxes being moved after the subpoena. The witness testimony documents Trump referring to classified documents as "my documents." The Corcoran notes record specific statements about hiding boxes. The advisor testimony documents that Trump was told repeatedly by his own trusted advisors that the fraud claims were false, and he continued pushing them anyway. The evidence is not ambiguous. It is not subject to competing interpretations. It is documented, recorded, and corroborated. The delay strategy reveals the weakness of the defense. A legal team that believed the evidence was weak would demand a speedy trial. A legal team that believed they could rebut the factual record would file detailed responses contesting specific claims. Instead, Trump's lawyers are asking for years of delay and filing procedural motions that avoid engaging with the evidence. That pattern is the strategic signature of a defense that has no factual answer and is therefore seeking to avoid the confrontation altogether. So here is the bottom line. Jack Smith concluded that the admissible evidence in both the election interference and classified documents cases was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. The only reason those cases never went to trial is because Trump won the election before they could. Judge Chutkan unsealed a 165-page brief and nearly 900 pages of evidence over the objections of Trump's lawyers, with the judge stating that keeping the evidence secret could look like election interference. The Pence notes, the surveillance footage, the witness testimony, and the Corcoran notes combine to form a documentary record that legal analysts say Trump's team is not even trying to rebut. Instead, they are asking for years of delay because the evidence lines up too neatly for a clean factual defense. The scramble is real. The evidence is irrefutable. And the only thing standing between the American people and a full accounting of that evidence in a court of law is the procedural clock that the defense is trying to run out. We are going to be watching every development as the legal maneuvering continues. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Does the delay strategy succeed in running out the clock? Or does the evidence eventually see the light of day in a courtroom? Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next update. I will see you in the next one.